What happens to a god when they die? Is that even possible? Can a god truly perish? If so, where are their corpses? Do they just vanish? Are they absorbed by the world? You will be surprised to know what the astral plane truly is and why it really was never meant to be seen. Why it was never meant to be found. That is because in reality, the astral plane is the graveyard of the gods, the place where their corpses float in perpetual eternity. Today we shall talk about the dead gods of the astral plane, but first, let's have a word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by the Seeker's Guide to Twisted Taverns. The book is a big collection of over 17 taverns, each filled with characters, quests, secrets, and magical items to explore and find. Let's be real here. How many times have you found yourself playing on an adventure and feeling bummed out that there isn't a dope-ass hideout for your characters or a cool hub where you can always come back to and relax? What the book offers is a bunch of locations where you can always take your players into after a long and arduous adventure for that sweet roleplay. And we don't really get many like this, let's be honest. In here you can find taverns ranging from grim and city locations in backwater taverns to world-shaping magical taverns. Save your seat at the table and pre-order the Seeker's Guide to Twisted Taverns in the link below. But now, back to the video. Stable matter in the astral is extraordinarily difficult to find. You can find it, of course. It does happen that a newly born conduit will connect to a prime world and rip a piece of land and yank it right into the astral, so floating debris is not impossible to find. However, the chances might as well be zero. What you will find instead are these oddly shaped hunks of rocky-looking material that certainly don't come from any material world. Pieces of land with their own gravity, with their own rules, almost as if they themselves defy the very nature of the plane. These, however, are not simple pieces of rock, but instead husks of things that used to be. The greatest and most powerful things existence actually had mustered. Quote, "How can a floating rock be a power? Well, sometimes a god's brought low. Something to the power is dead. But that ain't really so. The dead book has no room for a deity. Instead, a dead power is sent to the astral where no one was supposed to go, remember? Sentenced to float dormant and powerless. A power is a being of thought, of concepts, ideas, and most importantly, belief. It's said time and time again that on the planes, belief is power. No greater proof of this chant can be found than the dead gods themselves. Devoid of belief, they are returned to the mental realm of the astral where everything is only thought. There they drift like a nearly forgotten memory, empty husks of the awesome force they once embodied." End quote. The big question before we go any deeper really comes down to how exactly do gods die and whether or not that is even truly possible. We've had conversations about this in some of our past videos, specifically those where we cover the utterly immense power that deities have and all the different things that they can do, and if you remember those videos, then you should remember that mortals can't really harm deities. It doesn't really matter how strong you are as a character or how many of you there might be. The reality is that by the very nature of a deity being a deity, they are granted a tremendous set of abilities that simply just makes them invincible. At the end of the day, only a deity of similar rank or higher can kill another deity. In essence, divine power is necessary for the final blow to be delivered. This final blow also comes at a huge cost of the deity doing the deed, for it's not just the fact that you must have divine power running through your veins, but most of the divine power must be momentarily spent for the blow to count, leaving you weakened and vulnerable for many years. This virtually never happens. Gods fight each other all the time and they slay each other's avatars a lot, but much more than that is required to actually kill a deity. It's not just about having a deity stab another right in the heart, it's a whole complex process, and it is not common for a deity to be okay with being vulnerable to death even if it means killing another, especially considering the fact that many deities have friends who more than likely would want to achieve revenges upon you. There is, however, a different way that a god can die, one that is actually far more likely to happen and one that applies largely to our topic today. and that is through belief. See, gods are things of thought, of faith. A god exists many times over as a manifestation of his followers' belief and hopes. The more followers a god has, the more powerful it is. The more his people believe in what the god represents, the more powerful it is. So what happens when the opposite happens? What happens if a god loses its followers? What happens if those clerics lose faith in their god? Well, the god loses power. Quote, long ago, a power by the name of Fisinal had followings on two major prime material worlds and a realm on Arcadia. She was a goddess of the full moon and the light and safety that it brings into the void of night. One of the prime worlds was destroyed in a terrible celestial holocaust brought on by the wrath of other powers in Fisinal's pantheon. Fisinal's luck worsened from there as her worshippers on the remaining world began to forget her. Try as she might to make her presence known, her worship declined, and her followers turned to other powers or other concerns. Through magic or ordinary fire, they could bring their own light into the night, they claimed. Slowly, Fisinal's power began to wane. As this happened, her remaining priests lost their granted abilities and spells. They too began to leave her service. Over the centuries, these effects continued to worsen as a snowball grows rolling down a snowy hill. Her might and influence decreased as her followers abandoned her and more stopped worshipping her as her powers lessened. Slowly, pitifully, Fisinal faded away. Her realm receded and decayed, eventually becoming a vast wasteland. Fisinal fell into a deep sleep and faded away entirely. The Astral gained another floating island. End quote. Mortal followers sustain and give life to gods. That is how things are. Gods protect and help their followers because they have to or they risk dying. The interesting thing about this is that these stories are seldom known by the people that travel throughout the Astral. By the very nature of how this must transpire in order for a god to die, it is such that nobody actually knows who these gods are that float in the Astral. A god dies when it is forgotten, and so 99% of the time, nobody actually remembers who any of these floating corpses are because they died because they were forgotten. It is a particular sadness that one feels when they find a floating dead god on the Astral because there is no one to mourn them, no priest or cleric left, no one to remember them by. When a god dies in this fashion, their heaven simply wastes away and becomes a wasteland. Their celestial followers either leave or die, and their bodies get yanked out of the outer planes and right into the Astral. It is also important to mention, because I know that some of you might be wondering, only the belief of mortals give power to a god. The god might have millions or billions of spirits, angels, or previous followers in heaven, but they don't count for anything. As soon as a mortal follower dies, their faith loses power to the deity. Now the tricky part here is the word dead, because technically the god might look and feel dead, but in reality it is not. The word dead doesn't really apply to gods since they fundamentally function differently to us. I mean, after all, they're not mortal in any way and instead are entities of thought and belief. A deity that perishes merely falls into something more akin to a perpetual coma or sleep, as it slowly has its body turn more and more like a rock as it floats. This body is not the true shape or size of the deity. It might not even look like any of the forms that the god might have taken in life. Instead, what this husk really is just a collection that represents the thought of the deity. See, the thoughts that people have sometimes float freely on the Astral, though generally they take on the shape of the dangerous psychic winds that every once in a while rampage throughout the plane. For deities instead, they take on these rocky shapes that sort of hold the psychic thoughts and energies of the now forgotten deity. These energies are still there, just dormant, and every once in a while they manifest and lash out around them. A dormant goddess of nature might have trees grow on her husk. A dormant god of mining might have ores grow around it. A god of shadows might have demonic shadow people spawn every once in a while. The diverse nature of possibilities within the husk of a dead deity makes them particularly dangerous to approach because you really never know what sort of magical effect might be active around them. Generally speaking though, like I mentioned before, it is expected for the rules of the Astral to be sort of broken when you get close to a dead power. For example, most of them have strong gravity around them. Some of them might even break the slow time effect of the Astral, making time pass normally when within the surface of the husk, which is, by the way, extraordinarily dangerous. This is basically deadly for any kind of Astral natives, since it means that time will catch up to them extremely fast and basically kill them. Quote, "You must remember, my boy, fleshly bodies for gods are nothing more than a matter of convenience. The corpse of a god is not flesh. Flesh is inconsequential to divinity. The corpse of a god is memories, wars, heroes, regrets, sacrifices, prayers, the stuff of significance." End quote. Every 500 or so years, you might see a husk of a dead god project its memories or life around itself. This natives of the Astral called godquakes. What happens can be extremely varied, again, depending on the god, but generally it does manifest as a literal tremor followed by magical effects related to the god. It's typically very dangerous to anyone who might be living on top of said deity. There is a big difference between what natives might call a memory aura, which is essentially the always active effect around the dead deity, and then the stirrings or godquakes that happen irregularly throughout the centuries. The memory auras can be controlled and they are expected. The godquakes are really dangerous and typically would force everyone living on the dead god to leave for a few days and come back once the stirrings are over. The easiest way to actually figure out who the hell is the dead god is actually by closely studying these stirrings, because they, more than anything, show the memories, the alignment, and the life of the god itself. Though studying them, of course, can be extremely dangerous. Now, for those of you entrepreneurial sorts who might be wondering, hey, can't these memory auras be tapped into for power? Yes, they can. At least people believe they can be. Gods are beings of power, and the dead god husks are things of thought, which in the Astral is also power. Which means, of course, people have figured out ways to tap into this source of energy and then turn it into power. Many Githyanki clans have magical artifacts that allow them to drill into these dead powers and obtain magic from them, and other species have attempted and started to steal some of these technologies for themselves. This here is an example of such a person who has attempted to study the energies of a dead deity and turn it into usable energy. This is the Divinity Leech, a compound created by a human with the purposes of doing such. Quote, "The Divinity Leech is a huge semi-magical machine that supposedly draws the life energy from a dead god. The energy can be used for such varied purposes as raising the dead, creating and powering magical items, and even creating portals. How much of this is actually true is suspect." End quote. Now, why haven't we really figured this out? I mean, what would happen if you just, I don't know, blow a big hole in a dead god and then just see what's inside? Why can't we just grab a bunch of pickaxes, jab at a dead god, and then use the rock to, hey, form a magical blade or something? Well, the answer is because the dead gods have a protector, one who prevents people from doing that exact same thing. And this is probably the coolest part about the floating dead gods of the Astral, the part that you probably were not expecting, and that is, the protector of dead gods is none other than Anubius, the Egyptian god of the afterlife, of lost souls, and the helpless. This is something that sometimes surprises people, and I have mentioned it before a few times, but it always catches someone. But the Egyptian Pantheon actually is very much canon in Dungeons & Dragons, but more so than just being token pieces within the universe, they have real purpose and a place within the ecosystem. This is, for example, Ptah, and this art is canon in Dungeons & Dragons. He is a god of planeswalking, what you call a traveler god. See, clerics completely lose their god-given powers when they enter a prime world where their god is not present. There are some gods that make it a thing to have small presences in every world they encounter. This is a very peculiar activity of the Egyptian Pantheon, for example. In the Forgotten Realms, they are called the Mulhorandi Pantheon, and they have followers in this particular region of the continent. Anubius was once known as the guardian of the dead, part of the pantheon often referred to as the Egyptian gods. He watched over the dead spirits of the worshippers of his pantheon, keeping them from harm and making sure that they got to their proper place. Because of this duty, Anubius was familiar with the astral plane, the place that dead primes traveled through to get to their proper plane. As he carried out his duties, he noticed the increasing number of dead gods that floated lifelessly through the silver void. After being exposed to this sovereign, even frightening sight, it is said that Anubius began to think thoughts that do not readily come to the minds of a god. Thoughts of his own death, and the deaths of those powers he valued, filled his awareness. When Anubius saw mortal travelers attempting to tear apart the corpse of a fallen power, he took action. Anubius cast off his divinity. He, or rather it, became something entirely different, something unique in all the multiverse. Destroying the mortal offenders, Anubius became a steward over the inner powers. neither mortal nor power itself. It resided on the Astral all the time now, watching over the dead god isles. When it must be named, it is called the Guardian of Dead Gods." End quote. The former god still retains his old appearance as a sleek jackal-headed man with dark, proving eyes and muscular frame. And he sits on a throne-like chair where he takes copious notes about the nature of divine death. He can never be found upon the Astral unless you provoke his ire by doing sacrilege upon a dead god, at which point, nothing will stall your self-inflicted doom. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I know it's a short video, but I hope it was still enjoyable for you. I typically only make one video a week, but we did have 2 videos this week, so I hope that at least makes up for it. I would like to personally thank my Patreon supporters: Barry Maskand, 5e Magic Shop, Morgan Johnson, Rusty Rain, Doc Feeder, Walker Motley, The Great Codini, Terry Culp, Zirin King, Omega Scales, Ozol, Alex Cookson, Benjamin Bosters, Folky951, Ordoric, Prince Daylight Morning Crown, Sabim Kurshap, Solarensis, Thomas Hunt, Bushido Burrito, Nathan McComb, Soulless Rider, Werewolven Games, Lost Crusader, Mr. Salty, Stalia, Brian Camp, Shadega, Steven, JD Green, Olaf Clapp, Treb909, Tony RC, Famine52, George Fortland, Sovereign Mind, Trevor Hess, Draglugia5, The Living Guild Pack, Michael Walker, Striblo, Describe, Herbert Johnson, The Wizard's Vault, Dragon19, Guy97, James the Perverted, Shuddycast, Hiram at Questing Under Their Influence Podcast, Horrorbound, Jeffrey A. Alexander, Jesse Feliciano, and Anikon the Wolf of Shadows for supporting me on Patreon at the $25 level. If you would like to support me as well, then please head on over to patreon.com/MrRex to support. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you all next time.